From now on, you'll decide the next topic, drop your ideas in the comments, and whichever topic gets the most comments will be the one I make the next video on, so let's start the story. You are driving down a pitch-black highway at 3 in the morning. Your headlights cut through the darkness like twin blades. The only sound is the steady hum of your engine and the occasional crackle from your CB radio. Then you see her. A young woman in a white dress standing on the side of the road with her thumb out. What do? This is exactly what happened to Jake Martinez on a cold February night in 2019. Jake had been driving trucks for over 15 years. He had seen everything from tornadoes to blizzards to drunk drivers weaving across 4 lanes of traffic. But what he encountered that night on Interstate 10 just outside of San Antonio would make him question everything he thought he knew about life and death. Jake was hauling a load of electronics from Houston to Phoenix. It was a routine run he had made dozens of times before. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of him like a black ribbon cutting through the Texas landscape. He had been driving for 8 hours straight and was starting to feel the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing down on his eyelids. That is when he saw the woman. She appeared suddenly in his headlights about a quarter-mile ahead. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, with long blonde hair wearing a flowing white dress. She was standing perfectly still on the shoulder of the highway with her thumb extended toward the road. Jake slowed his rig and pulled over. Something about the woman seemed off, but he could not quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she stood so perfectly motionless. Maybe it was the fact that her white dress seemed to glow in the darkness. Or maybe it was the complete absence of any broken-down vehicle nearby. As Jake brought his 18-wheeler to a stop about 20 feet from where the woman stood, he rolled down his passenger side window and called out to her. "Hello there. You need some help." The woman turned to face him, and Jake felt his blood turn to ice. Her face was pale as moonlight, and her eyes were completely black. Not just dark brown or dark blue. Completely black like 2 empty holes in her skull. But the most disturbing thing was her smile. It stretched far too wide across her face, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp and too white. "I need to get home," she said in a voice that sounded like wind whistling through a cemetery. "My family is waiting for me." Every instinct Jake had developed over 15 years of long-haul trucking was screaming at him to put the truck in gear and get the hell out of there. But something about the woman kept him frozen in place. It was as if an invisible force was holding him to that spot on the highway. "Where is home?" Jake heard himself asking, even though he did not remember deciding to speak. The woman pointed down the highway in the direction Jake was already heading. "Just a few miles up the road," she said. "You will know it when you see it." Against his better judgment, Jake found himself nodding and motioning for the woman to climb into the cab. She moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking across the pavement. When she opened the passenger door, Jake noticed that her feet never seemed to actually touch the ground. The woman settled into the passenger seat without making a sound. Jake put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. As they drove, Jake tried to make conversation, but the woman only stared straight ahead through the windshield. Her presence filled the cab with a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into Jake's very soul. After about 10 minutes of driving, Jake saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Up ahead, on the right side of the highway, was a small white cross planted in the dirt beside the road. The kind of memorial that families put up to mark where a loved one died in a car accident. Fresh flowers had been placed at the base of the cross. The woman suddenly turned to look at Jake with those terrible black eyes. "This is where I get out," she said. "But there is nothing here," Jake protested. "Just that memorial cross." The woman smiled, that awful too wide smile again. "That cross is for me," she said. "I died on this spot exactly 50 years ago tonight. I have been waiting for someone to give me a ride home ever since." Before Jake could respond, the woman opened the passenger door and stepped out into the night. But instead of walking away, she simply vanished into thin air like smoke dissipating in the wind. Jake sat there for several minutes staring at the empty passenger seat, trying to process what had just happened. The next morning, Jake stopped at a truck stop about 50 miles down the road. He was still shaken by his encounter with the phantom hitchhiker and needed coffee and time to think. While he was filling up his truck with diesel fuel, an elderly mechanic approached him. "You look like you have seen a ghost, son," the mechanic said with a knowing smile. Jake told the mechanic about his experience the night before. The mechanic nodded as if he had heard the story many times before. "That would be Sarah Henderson," the mechanic explained. "She was killed in a car accident on that exact spot back in 1969. She was only 22 years old. Been picking up truckers and asking for rides home ever since. Some folks say she is still trying to get back to her family. Others say she is looking for the person who hit her and drove away." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "How many drivers have seen her?" he asked. The mechanic shrugged. "Hard to say for sure. Most folks do not talk about it. But I have been working at this truck stop for 30 years and I hear the stories. Sarah shows up every few months looking for a ride. Always on the anniversary of her death." Jake finished fueling his truck and got back on the road. But for the rest of his career, he always made sure to take a different route through Texas. He never wanted to encounter Sarah Henderson again. Some passengers are better left on the side of the road. But here is the thing that will really make your skin crawl. Jake was not the first driver to pick up Sarah that night. And he certainly was not the last. Because according to local law enforcement records, at least a dozen truckers reported picking up a mysterious woman in white on Interstate 10 that exact same night. The same night that marked exactly 50 years since Sarah Henderson died on that lonely stretch of highway. How is that possible, you might ask? How can the same ghost hitchhiker appear to multiple drivers on the same night? Well, that brings us to our next story from the highways of America. A story that will make you think twice about picking up strangers on dark country roads. Have you ever been so hungry that you would eat just about anything? That gnawing feeling in your stomach that makes it impossible to think about anything else. Now imagine you are driving through the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning and you have not eaten in 12 hours. Then suddenly, like a miracle, you see the warm glow of a diner sign cutting through the darkness ahead. Sounds like a blessing, right? Well, for Tommy Rodriguez, it turned out to be something else entirely. Tommy was a third-generation trucker from California. His grandfather had driven the same routes back in the 1950s. His father had taken over the family business in the 70s. And now Tommy was carrying on the tradition, hauling freight across the American heartland. He knew every truck stop, every way station, and every good place to grab a meal between Los Angeles and Chicago. That is why what happened to him on Highway 80 in Nebraska was so impossible to explain. It was a bitter cold night in January 2020. Snow was falling steadily and the wind was howling across the plains like a pack of hungry wolves. Tommy was hauling a load of produce from California to New York and was already running behind schedule due to the weather. He had been driving for 10 hours straight and his stomach was growling so loudly it was drowning out the country music on his radio. Tommy knew the stretch of highway like the back of his hand. He had driven it hundreds of times over the past 20 years. There were exactly 3 places to stop for food between Grand Island and North Platte. A McDonald's at the Lexington exit, a truck stop in Cozad, and a Subway sandwich shop in Gothenburg. That was it. Nothing else for over 100 miles of flat, empty farmland. So you can imagine Tommy's surprise when he crested a small hill and saw something that should not have been there. About a mile ahead, on the right side of the highway, was a neon sign that read Midnight Diner in glowing red letters. Below the main sign, smaller letters spelled out hot food 24 hours. Tommy rubbed his eyes, thinking he must be more tired than he realized. But the sign was definitely there, casting an eerie red glow across the snowy landscape. He could even see warm yellow light spilling out of the windows of a small building behind the sign. Tommy had no idea how he could have missed this place on his previous trips through Nebraska. But right now he was too hungry to care. He downshifted his truck and took the exit that led to the diner. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars covered in snow and one other semi-truck parked near the far end of the lot. Tommy pulled his rig into a space near the front door and climbed down from the cab. The wind cut through his jacket like a knife and snow stung his face as he hurried toward the entrance. The inside of the diner looked like something straight out of the 1950s. Red vinyl booths lined the walls. A long counter ran down the middle of the room with chrome stools bolted to the floor. An old jukebox in the corner was playing Patsy Cline. The air smelled like coffee and bacon grease and home-baked pie. A waitress with graying hair and kind eyes approached Tommy with a steaming cup of coffee before he even sat down. She was wearing a pink uniform with a name tag that read Dolores. "You look half-frozen, honey," she said with a warm smile. "Let me get you warmed up with some coffee." Tommy settled into a booth near the window and gratefully accepted the coffee. It was the best he had ever tasted. Rich and smooth with just a hint of vanilla. As he sipped the coffee, Tommy looked around the diner and noticed the other customers for the first time. There was an elderly man in overalls sitting at the counter reading a newspaper. A young couple sharing a piece of apple pie in the booth across from Tommy. And a trucker who looked to be in his 60s nursing a cup of coffee at the far end of the counter. Everyone seemed friendly enough, but there was something strange about the atmosphere in the diner. It was too quiet. Too still, like a photograph instead of a real place filled with real people. Dolores returned with a menu and Tommy ordered the biggest meal on the menu. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, a slice of chocolate cake for dessert, and more of that incredible coffee. While he waited for his food, Tommy tried to start a conversation with the other trucker at the counter. The man looked familiar somehow, like Tommy might have seen him at a truck stop or way station before. "Excuse me," Tommy called out. "Have we met before? You look familiar." The older trucker turned to look at Tommy and smiled. "I am sure we have crossed paths before, son. I have been driving these roads for a long time." There was something about the man's voice that sent a chill down Tommy's spine. It sounded distant and hollow, like an echo from the bottom of a well. When Tommy's food arrived, it was absolutely delicious. The best meal he had eaten in years. But as he ate, he began to notice strange details about the diner. The newspaper the elderly man was reading had a date from 1987. The jukebox was playing songs from the 1950s and 60s over and over in the same order. And none of the other customers seemed to be aging or changing position. They sat perfectly still like mannequins in a department store window. Tommy finished his meal and asked Dolores for the check. She smiled and told him it was on the house. A welcome gift for a weary traveler. Tommy thanked her and left a generous tip on the table before heading back out into the storm. The drive from the diner back to the highway should have taken about 5 minutes. But as Tommy navigated the snowy roads, he began to feel disoriented. The roads seemed to curve in directions he did not remember. The landscape looked different somehow. After 20 minutes of driving in circles, he finally found the on-ramp back to Highway 80. Tommy drove for another hour before stopping at the truck stop in Cozad to fuel up. While he was paying for his diesel fuel, he mentioned the Midnight Diner to the cashier. The cashier gave him a strange look. "There is no diner between here and North Platte," she said. "Just empty farmland for miles." Tommy insisted that he had just eaten at the diner less than 2 hours ago. He even showed the cashier the receipt Dolores had given him. But when he pulled the paper out of his wallet, it was blank. Completely blank. The cashier suggested that Tommy might have been dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion. But Tommy knew what he had experienced was real. The taste of that coffee was still on his tongue. He could still smell the bacon grease on his clothes. Tommy continued on to New York and delivered his load without any other incidents. But he could not stop thinking about the midnight diner. When he returned to California, he did some research online trying to find information about the mysterious restaurant. What he discovered made his blood run cold. According to historical records, there had been a diner at that exact location back in the 1950s. It was called the Midnight Diner and was owned by a woman named Dolores Martinez. The diner was a popular stop for truckers traveling Highway 80 across Nebraska. But the diner had burned down in 1987. Dolores and 3 customers died in the fire. The cause was never determined, but investigators suspected faulty wiring in the old building. Tommy found old photographs of the diner online, and they matched his memory perfectly, down to the red vinyl booths and the chrome stools and the jukebox in the corner. He even found a photograph of Dolores Martinez. It was the same woman who had served him coffee that snowy night. Tommy tried to drive past the location on his next trip through Nebraska, but there was nothing there. Just an empty field covered in snow. No sign, no building, no evidence that a diner had ever existed at that spot. But sometimes late at night, when Tommy is driving through Nebraska, he swears he can still see that red neon sign glowing in the distance. And sometimes when the wind is just right, he can smell coffee and bacon grease drifting across the plains. The question that keeps Tommy awake at night is this: if the diner burned down in 1987 and everyone inside died in the fire, then who was serving him coffee that night? And more importantly, why did they want him to stay? What would you do if you were being followed by a car that should not exist? A car that appears in your mirrors when you are alone on a deserted highway, but vanishes the moment you try to get a closer look. This is the nightmare that has been haunting truck drivers on Route 66 for over 70 years. Marcus Thompson discovered this legend was all too real during a late-night haul through the Arizona desert in September 2021. Marcus was a veteran driver with over 20 years of experience behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. He had driven through every state in the continental United States. He had survived blizzards in Montana, ice storms in Michigan, and dust storms in Nevada. But nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter on that moonless night in the Sonoran Desert. Marcus was hauling a load of furniture from Los Angeles to Dallas. It was a straight shot across the desert on Interstate 40, which follows the historic Route 66 through much of Arizona and New Mexico. Marcus loved this run because the highways were usually empty at night and he could make good time without dealing with heavy traffic. But on this particular night, something felt different from the moment Marcus crossed the California border into Arizona. The darkness seemed thicker, somehow more oppressive. The usual desert sounds of coyotes and owls were absent. Even his CB radio was eerily quiet, with none of the usual chatter from other truckers. Marcus was about 50 miles east of Flagstaff when he first noticed the headlights in his mirrors. 2 perfectly round beams of light following about a quarter-mile behind him. At first, Marcus did not think much of it. Plenty of cars traveled this highway even in the middle of the night. But as the miles passed, the headlights maintained exactly the same distance, never getting closer, never falling farther behind. Marcus tried slowing down to let the other vehicle pass, but the headlights slowed down too. He tried speeding up, but the mysterious car matched his pace perfectly. After 30 minutes of this strange dance, Marcus grabbed his CB radio and tried to make contact with the other driver. "Breaker, breaker, this is Freight Dog heading eastbound on 40. Come back." Static was the only response. Marcus tried again. "Vehicle following me about a quarter-mile back, you got your ears on. Come back." Still nothing but static. Marcus was starting to feel uneasy. In 20 years of trucking, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct he had was telling him something was very wrong. He decided to take the next exit and see if the mysterious car would follow him off the highway. The Winona exit was coming up in about 5 miles. It was little more than a few abandoned buildings and a closed gas station, but it would serve Marcus's purpose. He slowed down and took the exit, watching his mirrors carefully. The headlights followed him. Marcus pulled into the parking lot of the abandoned gas station and climbed down from his cab to get a better look at his mysterious shadow. But as soon as he stepped onto the pavement, the headlights vanished. Not like a car driving away, but like someone had simply turned off a light switch. One moment they were there, the next moment they were gone. Marcus walked around his truck, checking for any signs of another vehicle. The parking lot was empty except for his rig. No tire tracks in the dust. No engine sounds fading into the distance. Nothing. Marcus was beginning to think he had been imagining things when he heard the sound of a car door slamming shut somewhere in the darkness. He spun around trying to locate the source of the sound, but saw nothing. Then he heard footsteps crunching on gravel slowly circling his truck. "Hello," Marcus called out. "Anyone out there?" The footsteps stopped. Marcus climbed back into his cab and locked the doors. He sat there for several minutes listening to the desert silence before finally starting his engine and pulling back onto the highway. As soon as he merged onto Interstate 40, the headlights appeared in his mirrors again. This time Marcus was determined to get a better look at the mystery car. At the next truck stop, he pulled in and parked where he would have a clear view of any vehicle that followed him. The headlights followed him into the parking lot, but instead of parking, they began to circle slowly around the perimeter of the truck stop. As the mystery car passed under a street light, Marcus finally got a clear look at it. It was a black 1947 Cadillac in perfect condition. The chrome bumpers gleamed like mirrors. The paint was so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And behind the wheel, Marcus could see the silhouette of a man wearing what appeared to be a suit and fedora. Marcus tried to flag down the Cadillac, but it continued its slow circle around the truck stop, ignoring him completely. After about 10 minutes, the car pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the highway heading east. Inside the truck stop, Marcus told the cashier about his strange encounter. The young man behind the counter went pale when Marcus described the black Cadillac. "You saw him?" the cashier whispered. "The ghost of Route 66. The cashier explained that truckers had been reporting encounters with the mysterious black Cadillac since the early 1950s. According to legend, the car was driven by a man named Vincent Morrison, who had been a traveling salesman back in the 1940s. Morrison had been driving his brand new Cadillac from Chicago to Los Angeles in 1947 when he disappeared somewhere in the Arizona desert. His car was never found. His body was never recovered. But starting in 1950, truck drivers began reporting encounters with a black Cadillac that would follow them for miles through the desert before vanishing without a trace. The sightings always followed the same pattern. The car would appear in the trucker's mirrors at night, maintaining a constant distance but never trying to pass. If the trucker tried to confront the mystery driver, the car would simply disappear. Some drivers reported that the Cadillac would appear during times of danger, warning them of accidents or mechanical problems ahead. Others claimed the ghost car was malevolent, trying to force trucks off the road or into oncoming traffic. Marcus asked the cashier if anyone had ever gotten a good look at the driver. The young man nodded grimly. "A few drivers have gotten close enough to see his face," the cashier said. "They all described the same thing. The driver looks like he is from the 1940s. Suit and tie, fedora hat, and a thin mustache. But his eyes are completely black and his skin is gray like ash." Marcus thanked the cashier and got back on the road. He hoped that would be the end of his encounter with the ghost of Route 66, but the black Cadillac was waiting for him at the edge of the truck stop parking lot. As Marcus merged back onto Interstate 40, the mystery car fell into formation behind him again. For the next 200 miles, the Cadillac maintained its position exactly 1/4 mile behind Marcus's truck. It never tried to pass. It never fell behind. It just followed like a faithful but unwelcome companion through the desert night. As the sun began to rise over the New Mexico border, Marcus looked in his mirrors one last time. The black Cadillac was gone. It had vanished with the darkness, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. Marcus completed his delivery in Dallas without any other incidents. But he could not shake the feeling that he had encountered something beyond explanation on that lonely stretch of desert highway. When he returned home to California, he did some research on Vincent Morrison and the ghost of Route 66. What he found was disturbing. According to police records from 1947, Vincent Morrison had indeed disappeared while driving from Chicago to Los Angeles. His wife had reported him missing when he failed to arrive at his scheduled destination. A massive search was conducted along Route 66, but no trace of Morrison or his car was ever found. But here is the truly chilling part. In the 74 years since Morrison's disappearance, over 300 truck drivers have reported encounters with the black Cadillac. The descriptions are always identical. A 1947 Cadillac in perfect condition, driven by a man in a suit and fedora who follows truckers through the desert before vanishing at sunrise. And according to accident reports, there have been 17 fatal crashes on Route 66 in Arizona, where the investigating officers found evidence of a second vehicle that fled the scene. A vehicle that left tire tracks matching those of a 1947 Cadillac, but was never located despite extensive searches. Is Vincent Morrison still driving Route 66 after all these years? Is he trying to warn truckers of danger ahead, or is he causing the accidents himself? The answer to that question might depend on whether you believe the dead can return to settle unfinished business. But one thing is certain. If you are ever driving through the Arizona desert at night and you see a pair of headlights in your mirror maintaining a perfect distance behind you, do not try to get a closer look. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Imagine driving through the Georgia mountains on a foggy night when suddenly you hear a child crying. Not from your radio or your phone, but from somewhere inside your truck cab. A sound so heartbreaking that it makes you want to pull over and search every inch of your vehicle to find the source. This is exactly what happened to Linda Mitchell on a humid August night that would change her forever. Linda had been driving trucks for 12 years. She was one of the few women in long-haul trucking, and she had earned the respect of her male colleagues through hard work, determination, and an unshakable nerve. Linda had driven through hurricanes, tornadoes, and ice storms. She had dealt with aggressive drivers, mechanical failures, and every other challenge the road could throw at her. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the night she encountered the crying child of Interstate 75. Linda was hauling a load of textiles from North Carolina to Florida. It was a run she had made countless times before taking Interstate 75 south through the mountains of northern Georgia. The weather had been clear when she started her trip, but as she entered Georgia, a thick fog began to roll in from the mountains, reducing visibility to just a few yards. Linda slowed her truck to a safe speed and turned on her fog lights. She had driven in fog before and knew the key was to stay calm and maintain a steady pace. The highway was nearly deserted at 2 in the morning, with only occasional pairs of headlights passing in the opposite direction like ghosts in the mist. Linda was about 30 miles south of Macon when she first heard the crying. It started as a faint whimpering sound, barely audible over the hum of her engine. At first, Linda thought it might be coming from her CB radio or maybe the wind whistling through a gap in her cab. But as the sound grew louder, she realized it was the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing. Linda immediately pulled over at the next rest stop and conducted a thorough search of her truck. She checked the sleeper compartment, the storage areas, and even opened the trailer to make sure no one had somehow hidden inside her cargo. But the truck was empty. There was no child anywhere to be found. As Linda stood in the parking lot of the rest stop, she could still hear the crying. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the woods that surrounded the rest area. Linda called out into the darkness, hoping to locate a lost child who might need help. "Hello," she shouted. "Is someone out there? Are you hurt?" The crying stopped immediately, as if someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the crying had been. Linda waited for several minutes but heard nothing except the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Linda climbed back into her truck and continued south. But within minutes of getting back on the highway, the crying started again. This time it was louder and more urgent. The sound of a child in desperate distress calling out for help. Linda's maternal instincts kicked in, and she found herself scanning the roadside for any sign of a child who might be in danger. The crying continued for the next 50 miles, sometimes fading to a whisper, sometimes rising to heartbreaking sobs that filled the truck cab. Linda tried turning up her radio to drown out the sound, but somehow the crying was always louder. She tried opening her windows, thinking the sound might be coming from outside, but the crying was definitely coming from inside the truck. Linda was approaching the outskirts of Valdosta when the crying suddenly changed. Instead of the general distress she had been hearing, the child began to speak. "Help me," the small voice pleaded. "Please help me. Cannot find my mommy." Linda's heart broke at the sound of those words. Even though she could not see the child, she found herself speaking to the empty cab. "Where are you, sweetheart?" Linda said gently. "I want to help you, but I cannot see you." "I am so scared," the child's voice replied. "It is so dark here. I have been waiting for so long." Linda pulled over at the next exit, determined to figure out what was happening. She parked at a well-lit truck stop and once again searched every inch of her vehicle. As she searched, she kept talking to the child, trying to comfort the frightened voice. "What is your name, honey?" Linda asked. "Sarah," the child replied. "My name is Sarah and I am 7 years old. I was in the car with mommy and daddy when the bad thing happened." "What bad thing?" Linda asked, but the only response was more crying. Linda went into the truck stop and asked the clerk if there had been any reports of missing children in the area. The clerk said he had not heard of any, but suggested Linda call the police if she thought a child was in danger. Linda was not sure how to explain that she could hear a child crying, but could not locate the source of the sound. As Linda walked back to her truck, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench outside the building. He was wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt and looked like a retired trucker. When he saw Linda approaching, he stood up and walked over to her. "You have been hearing the crying child, have you not?" he said. It was not a question but a statement. Linda nodded, unable to speak. The old man introduced himself as Earl Watson. He had been driving trucks for 40 years before retiring 5 years earlier. During his career, he had encountered the crying child 3 different times, always on Interstate 75 in Georgia and always on foggy nights. "Her name is Sarah Williamson," Earl explained. "She was 7 years old when she died in a car accident on I-75 back in 1987. The whole family was killed when their car hit a patch of ice and slammed into a bridge abutment. Sarah was thrown from the vehicle and her body was never found despite massive search efforts." Earl went on to explain that truckers had been reporting encounters with Sarah for over 30 years. She always appeared on foggy nights crying and calling for help. Some drivers said they could see her standing on the roadside in a white dress. Others only heard her voice inside their truck cabs. According to Earl, Sarah was not malicious or dangerous. She was simply a lost child trying to find her way home to her parents. But her presence could be deeply disturbing, especially for drivers who had children of their own. "Most truckers who encounter Sarah try to help her," Earl continued. "They pull over and search for her. They talk to her and try to comfort her. But there is nothing anyone can do. She has been lost for over 30 years and she will probably be lost for 30 more. Linda asked Earl why Sarah attached herself to truck drivers specifically. Earl shrugged. "Maybe she sees truckers as protectors," he suggested. "People who help others in trouble. Or maybe truck drivers are just more likely to be traveling alone at night when the veil between worlds is thinnest." Linda thanked Earl for the information and got back on the road. As expected, Sarah's crying started again as soon as Linda merged onto Interstate 75. But this time Linda was not afraid. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sadness for the lost child. For the remaining 200 miles to her destination, Linda talked to Sarah. She told her stories, sang her songs, and tried to comfort her in whatever way she could. Sometimes Sarah would respond asking questions about Linda's truck or commenting on the places they passed. But mostly she just cried softly like a child who had given up hope of ever finding her way home. As Linda crossed the state line into Florida, Sarah's voice began to fade. By the time Linda reached her delivery point in Tampa, the truck cab was silent again. Sarah had returned to whatever realm she inhabited when not seeking help from passing truckers. Linda completed her delivery and began the drive back to North Carolina. She took a different route, avoiding Interstate 75 in Georgia. She never encountered Sarah again, but she never forgot the sound of that lost child crying in the darkness. Linda did some research when she got home and confirmed Earl's story. The Williamson family had indeed died in a car accident on Interstate 75 in December 1987. Sarah Williamson's body was never recovered despite extensive searches by police and volunteers. The accident report mentioned that weather conditions were poor, with heavy fog reducing visibility to near zero. Over the years, Linda has spoken to other drivers who have encountered Sarah. Their stories are remarkably consistent. A 7-year-old girl crying for help on foggy nights along Interstate 75 in Georgia. Some drivers have tried to ignore her, but most find it impossible to resist the urge to help a child in distress. Linda believes Sarah is still out there searching for her parents, or maybe just looking for someone to care about her. She encourages other drivers who encounter Sarah to talk to her and try to comfort her, even though there is ultimately nothing anyone can do to help her find peace. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing on a dark highway is not a monster or a ghost, but simply a lost child who will never find her way home. Have you ever been driving alone on a deserted highway when suddenly your radio starts picking up strange transmissions? Voices from the past broadcasting messages that should not exist. This is the terrifying reality that truck driver Mike Patterson experienced on a frozen February night in Wyoming when he encountered something that science cannot explain. Mike had been driving trucks for 18 years, specializing in cross-country hauls that took him from coast to coast. He loved the solitude of long-distance trucking and the freedom of the open road. Mike was also a bit of a technology enthusiast who had invested in a high-end CB radio system and a shortwave radio that could pick up transmissions from around the world. On this particular night, Mike was hauling a load of machinery from Denver to Seattle. Interstate 80 through Wyoming was his preferred route even in winter because it was usually well-maintained and relatively straight. The weather forecast had called for light snow, but as Mike entered Wyoming, the storm intensified, rapidly turning into a full-blown blizzard. By the time Mike reached Laramie, the wind was howling at 60 miles per hour and snow was falling so heavily that his headlights could barely penetrate more than a few feet ahead. Mike slowed his truck to 30 miles per hour and activated his hazard lights. He had driven in blizzards before, but this storm was particularly fierce. Mike was about 50 miles west of Laramie when his CB radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Breaker 19, this is Big Thunder eastbound on 80 at mile marker 274. Got a smoky report for westbound traffic. Come back. Mike keyed his microphone to respond. This is Mile High Mike westbound approaching 274. Go ahead with your smoky report, Big Thunder. But instead of information about police activity, Mike heard something that made his blood run cold. The voice on the radio was fading in and out as if the transmission was coming from very far away. And the words were not what Mike expected to hear. Mile High Mike, this is Big Thunder. I need to warn you about something up ahead. There has been an accident at mile marker 268. Multiple vehicles involved. Do not stop to help. Do not get out of your truck. The people there are not what they seem to be. Mike was confused by the cryptic warning. If there was a serious accident ahead, he would definitely need to stop and render aid if possible. That was not just the right thing to do, it was required by federal regulations for commercial drivers. Mike tried to respond to Big Thunder but got only static in return. He switched to different CB channels, trying to raise other truckers in the area, but the airwaves were eerily quiet. The only sound was the howling wind and the steady rhythm of his wipers fighting the heavy snow. As Mike approached mile marker 268, he saw flashing lights ahead. Red and blue emergency lights cutting through the blizzard like beacons in the darkness. Mike slowed his truck and prepared to stop. But as he got closer, he realized something was very wrong with the scene ahead. There were indeed multiple vehicles scattered across the highway. A pickup truck was overturned in the median. A sedan was smashed against the guardrail, and a semi-truck was jackknifed across both westbound lanes. But there were no ambulances or fire trucks or police cars despite the flashing emergency lights. Mike brought his truck to a stop about 100 yards from the accident scene and grabbed his CB microphone. Breaker, this is Mile High Mike at mile marker 268 on Interstate 80 westbound. I need emergency services at this location immediately. Multiple vehicle accident with possible injuries. No response except static. Mike tried his cell phone but had no signal. That was not unusual in this remote part of Wyoming, especially during a storm. He grabbed his flashlight and winter coat and prepared to get out of his truck to check for survivors. But as Mike opened his door, he heard Big Thunder /S voice on the CB radio again. Mile High Mike, do not get out of that truck. I repeat, do not get out of that truck. Those people are not alive. Mike paused with one foot on the step of his cab. He looked toward the accident scene and saw figures moving between the wrecked vehicles. People in winter coats walking around the wreckage as if searching for something. At first, Mike was relieved to see that there were survivors who could move around. But then he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The figures were not leaving footprints in the snow. Mike watched in horror as the ghostly figures glided across the snowy highway without disturbing the pristine white surface. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, weaving between the wrecked vehicles like they were performing some kind of ritual. One of the figures noticed Mike /S truck and began walking toward him. Even through the heavy snow, Mike could see that something was terribly wrong with the approaching person. The figure moved with an unnatural gait like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. And as it got closer, Mike could see that its face was pale and expressionless with dark, hollow eyes. Mike slammed his door shut and locked it. His hands were shaking as he reached for the CB microphone. Big Thunder, this is Mile High Mike. What are those things out there? Big Thunder /S voice came through clearly despite the storm. They are the victims of accidents that happened on this stretch of highway over the past 50 years. They appear during blizzards trying to lure living people out of their vehicles. If you get out of your truck, they will take your place among the dead and you will be trapped here forever. The pale figure had reached Mike /S truck and was now standing beside the driver /S door. It raised one skeletal hand and tapped on the window with fingernails that were black as coal. Mike could see its face clearly now and wished he could not. The skin was gray and waxy like that of a corpse. The eyes were completely black with no trace of white or color. And when the thing smiled, Mike could see that its teeth were cracked and yellow. The figure began to speak, but its voice came not from outside the truck, but from Mike /S CB radio. Please help me, the voice said. I am hurt. I need to get to a hospital. Please open your door. Mike grabbed his microphone with trembling hands. Big Thunder, I need your help. One of those things is right outside my truck. You need to leave immediately, Big Thunder replied. Put your truck in gear and drive through the accident scene. Do not stop for anything. The road ahead is clear. But Mike hesitated. The figure outside his truck looked so human, so desperate for help. Every instinct he had developed over 18 years of trucking told him to help people in distress. But Big Thunder /S warning echoed in his mind. The figure began tapping on the window more insistently. Its black eyes stared directly into Mike /S soul, and its voice continued to plead through the CB radio. "I have children at home," the voice said. "Please do not leave me here to die. Just open your door for 1 minute. That is all I need." Mike looked toward the accident scene and saw that all of the ghostly figures had stopped what they were doing and were now facing his truck. They began to move toward him in unison, walking in perfect formation like soldiers marching to battle. Mike made his decision. He put his truck in gear and stepped on the accelerator. The 18-wheeler lurched forward toward the accident scene. As Mike drove through the wreckage, the ghostly figures tried to grab onto his truck, but their hands passed through the metal like smoke. The figure that had been beside his door let out a shriek of rage that came through every channel on his CB radio simultaneously. Mike drove through the accident scene without slowing down. As soon as he passed the last wrecked vehicle, the emergency lights vanished and the ghostly figures disappeared. The highway ahead was clear, just as Big Thunder had promised. Mike tried to contact Big Thunder to thank him for the warning but got no response. He drove for another hour before stopping at a truck stop in Rock Springs. While he was fueling his truck, Mike asked the cashier about accidents on Interstate 80 near mile marker 268. The cashier shook his head grimly. "That is a bad stretch of highway," she said. "There have been dozens of fatal accidents there over the years. Something about the way the wind blows through that valley creates whiteout conditions even when it is not snowing that hard. Truckers call it the Devil/S Canyon." Mike asked if she had ever heard of a driver using the handle Big Thunder. The cashier/S face went pale. "Big Thunder was killed in an accident right around mile marker 268 about 10 years ago," the cashier explained. "His real name was Robert Thompson. He was trying to help victims of a multi-car pileup when another truck lost control in the snow and hit him. Real tragedy. He was one of the good ones, always trying to help other drivers." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. If Big Thunder had died 10 years ago, then who had been talking to him on the CB radio that night? Mike completed his delivery in Seattle and returned home to Denver. But he could not stop thinking about his encounter on Interstate 80. He did some research and discovered that Robert Thompson had indeed been killed while trying to help accident victims during a blizzard in February 2011. Thompson had been known throughout the trucking community for his willingness to help other drivers in distress. But here is the part that really made Mike question everything he thought he knew about life and death. According to CB radio logs maintained by the Wyoming State Patrol, Big Thunder/S radio call sign had been used over 40 times since Thompson/S death, always during blizzards on Interstate 80. Always to warn truckers about dangerous conditions or supernatural encounters. It seemed that even in death, Robert Thompson was still trying to protect his fellow truckers from the dangers of the highway, including the restless spirits of accident victims who were trapped forever in the Devil/S Canyon, searching for living souls to take their place among the dead. Mike has driven Interstate 80 through Wyoming many times since that night, but he has never encountered the ghostly accident scene again. He has also never heard Big Thunder/S voice on the CB radio. But Mike keeps his radio tuned to channel 19 just in case. Because you never know when you might need a guardian angel to guide you through the darkness. And sometimes the best guardian angels are the ones who have already traveled the road you are on and know where all the dangers lie waiting. What would you do if you pulled into a gas station that should not exist? A place that appears when you are desperate for fuel but vanishes without a trace once you leave. This nightmare became reality for truck driver Carlos Mendez on a sweltering summer night in the Louisiana Bayou country. Carlos had been driving trucks for 15 years, hauling loads across the southern United States. He specialized in runs through Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, where his fluency in both English and Spanish made him valuable to companies that dealt with international freight. Carlos prided himself on his meticulous planning and his intimate knowledge of every truck stop and fuel station along his regular routes. That is why what happened to him on Highway 10 between Baton Rouge and Lafayette was so impossible to explain. It was July 2022 and Louisiana was in the grip of a brutal heat wave. Temperatures had been over 100 degrees for 6 straight days, and the humidity made it feel even hotter. Carlos was hauling a load of construction materials from Houston to Mobile and was already running behind schedule due to traffic delays in Houston. Carlos had planned to fuel up at the Flying J truck stop in Lafayette, but as he approached the city, his fuel gauge showed he was cutting it dangerously close. His truck was a fuel-efficient model, but the stop-and-go traffic in the Houston heat had caused him to burn through diesel faster than expected. Carlos checked his GPS for alternative fuel stops, but the nearest station was still 20 miles ahead. His low fuel warning light had been on for the past 10 miles, and he was starting to worry about running out of diesel on the side of the highway. Breaking down in the Louisiana heat could be dangerous, especially at night when temperatures were still in the 90s. That is when Carlos saw the miracle that would soon become his nightmare. About 2 miles ahead, on the right side of the highway, a neon sign cut through the darkness. Gulf Station Diesel 24 hours. Below the main sign, smaller letters advertised hot food, cold drinks, and clean restrooms. Carlos had driven this route dozens of times over the past 15 years, and he was certain there had never been a gas station at this location. But right now, he was too desperate for fuel to question his good fortune. He downshifted his truck and took the exit that led to the station. The Gulf Station looked like something from the 1970s. A small rectangular building with large windows and a red-tiled roof. 2 islands of gas pumps sat under a canopy that was lit by fluorescent lights buzzing with insects. A single diesel pump was positioned off to the side near the building. The whole place had a nostalgic feel, like a scene from an old movie about road trips across America. Carlos pulled his truck up to the diesel pump and climbed down from his cab. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of swamp water from the nearby bayou. Crickets chirped in the darkness beyond the reach of the station / lights, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted mournfully. The diesel pump was an older model with mechanical numbers that flipped as the fuel flowed. Carlos inserted his credit card, but the reader displayed an error message. He tried his company fuel card with the same result. Finally, he decided to go inside and pay cash. The interior of the Gulf Station was a time capsule from decades past. The walls were lined with shelves stocked with vintage snacks and sodas. A cooler hummed in the corner filled with glass bottles of Coca-Cola and Royal Crown Cola. The cash register was an old mechanical model that required the clerk to punch keys and pull a lever to complete transactions. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his 60s. He had graying hair slicked back with pomade and wore a short-sleeved shirt with a name tag that read Earl. The man smiled warmly as Carlos approached the counter. "Evening, stranger," Earl said in a thick Louisiana accent. "Hot night for traveling." Carlos nodded and pulled out his wallet. "I need to fill up my truck with diesel. The card readers on your pump are not working." Earl chuckled. "Those newfangled electronic contraptions are always breaking down. But do not worry, we can handle cash just fine." "How much you need?" Carlos calculated that he would need about 150 gallons to fill his tanks. At current diesel prices, that would cost around $600. He only had $300 in cash. "I can pay $300 now and give you my credit card information for the rest," Carlos suggested. Earl waved his hand dismissively. "Do not worry about it, friend. You look like an honest man. Fill up your truck and pay me what you can. We can settle the rest next time you come through." Carlos was surprised by Earl's trusting attitude, but gratefully accepted the offer. He returned to his truck and began fueling up. The diesel flowed slowly from the old pump, and Carlos used the time to walk around his rig, checking his tires and lights. As Carlos walked around his truck, he noticed something strange about the Gulf Station. Despite the late hour and the remote location, there were several other customers moving around the property. A family with young children was loading groceries into a station wagon. An elderly couple was filling up a classic Buick at one of the gas pumps. A group of teenagers was sharing sodas and snacks outside the store. But something was off about all of these people. They moved too slowly and spoke too quietly. Their clothes looked like they were from different decades, ranging from the 1960s to the 1980s. And when Carlos tried to make eye contact with any of them, they seemed to look right through him as if he was not there. The diesel pump clicked off, indicating that Carlos' /S tanks were full. He walked back into the store to pay Earl the $300 he had promised. Earl smiled as he counted the bills. "That should cover it, friend. You drive safe now and watch out for the fog rolling in from the bayou." Carlos thanked Earl and headed back to his truck. But as he climbed into his cab, he realized he had forgotten to get a receipt for his fuel purchase. His company required receipts for all fuel transactions, so Carlos walked back into the store. But Earl was no longer behind the counter. In fact, the entire store was different. The vintage snacks and sodas were gone, replaced by modern inventory. The old mechanical cash register had been replaced by a computerized point-of-sale system. And behind the counter stood a young woman Carlos had never seen before. "Excuse me," Carlos said. "Where is Earl, the man who was working here a few minutes ago?" The woman looked confused. "Sir, I have been working alone tonight since 6 o'clock. There is no one here named Earl. And we do not sell diesel fuel. This is just a regular gas station." Carlos looked around the store in bewilderment. Everything had changed in the few minutes he had been outside. Even the layout of the shelves was different. Carlos asked the woman what time it was. "It is almost midnight," she replied. But that was impossible. When Carlos had first pulled into the Gulf station, it had been just after 10 o'clock. He had only been there for about 30 minutes. How could 2 hours have passed without him noticing? Carlos thanked the confused clerk and walked back to his truck. As he started his engine, he looked at his fuel gauge. Both tanks showed completely full, just as they had when he left Earl/S Gulf station. But according to the truck/S computer, he had not purchased any fuel. Carlos drove away from the gas station more confused than ever. He looked in his mirrors, expecting to see the Gulf station/S neon sign, but there was only darkness. It was as if the station had never existed. The next morning, Carlos called his dispatcher to report the strange fuel transaction. His dispatcher checked with the company/S credit card processor and confirmed that no fuel purchases had been recorded on Carlos/S route the previous night. But Carlos/S fuel tanks were definitely full, and his truck/S computer showed no record of the fuel being purchased. Carlos returned to the same location on his next trip through Louisiana, hoping to find Earl and pay the remaining balance for his fuel. But there was no gas station at that exit. Just an empty field and a historical marker indicating that a small community had once existed at that spot. Carlos read the historical marker with growing unease. The sign explained that the community of Belgrove had been a thriving truck stop and trading post along Highway 10 during the 1970s and early 1980s. The town had been destroyed by Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and was never rebuilt. Among the businesses lost in the hurricane was Earl/S Gulf Station, owned and operated by Earl Thibodeau, who died when the storm surge flooded the area. Carlos researched Earl Thibodeau online and found several old newspaper articles about the hurricane/S devastation. There was even a photograph of Earl standing in front of his Gulf station taken just months before the hurricane hit. It was definitely the same man who had sold Carlos diesel fuel on that mysterious night. Carlos has driven past that exit dozens of times since his encounter with Earl/S Gulf station, but he has never seen the station again. Other truckers who work the same route have told Carlos similar stories about phantom truck stops and gas stations that appear when drivers are in desperate need of fuel or food. Some believe these phantom stops are a form of divine intervention, helping travelers in their time of need. Others think they are traps set by malevolent spirits trying to lure unsuspecting drivers into some supernatural realm. Carlos is not sure what to believe. All he knows is that Earl Thibodeau saved him from running out of fuel on a dangerous stretch of highway and asked for nothing in return except trust and kindness. If that was the work of a ghost, then Carlos considers himself blessed to have encountered such a benevolent spirit. But sometimes late at night, when Carlos is driving through the Louisiana Bayou country, he finds himself looking for that familiar neon sign cutting through the darkness. Part of him hopes to see Earl/S Gulf Station again, so he can properly thank the kind man who helped him in his time of need. And part of him hopes he never sees it again because some mysteries are too frightening to solve. Have you ever looked in your rearview mirror and seen something that could not possibly be there? Your own truck following behind you, driven by someone who looks exactly like you. This is the terrifying experience that shattered the sanity of veteran truck driver Robert Hayes on a routine run through Oklahoma that became anything but routine. Robert had been driving trucks for 22 years. He was known throughout the industry as one of the most reliable and professional drivers on the road. Robert had an impeccable safety record and had never been involved in a serious accident. He was meticulous about maintaining his equipment and following all regulations. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the night he encountered his own doppelganger on Interstate 35. It was October 2020 and Robert was hauling a load of electronics from Dallas to Kansas City. The weather was clear and traffic was light as he drove north through Oklahoma. Robert was making good time and expected to reach his destination ahead of schedule. He was listening to classic rock on his satellite radio and feeling relaxed as the miles rolled by. Robert was about 50 miles north of Oklahoma City when he first noticed the truck in his mirrors. It was identical to his own, rig down to the smallest detail. Same make and model of tractor. Same trailer configuration. Same paint scheme and company logos. Even the license plates appeared to be identical. At first, Robert assumed it was just another truck from his company. They operated a large fleet, and it was not unusual to encounter other drivers from the same company on major interstate highways. But as Robert looked more closely at the truck following him, he began to notice disturbing details that made his blood run cold. The truck was maintaining exactly the same speed as Robert/S rig, staying precisely 1/4 mile behind him. When Robert sped up, the other truck sped up. When Robert slowed down, the other truck slowed down. It was like looking at his own reflection in a mirror. Robert grabbed his CB radio and tried to contact the other driver. Breaker 19, this is Honest Bob northbound on 35 at mile marker 142. Come back, driver of the blue Peterbilt behind me. No response except static. Robert tried again on different channels, but the mysterious driver never answered. Robert could see the silhouette of a person behind the wheel of the other truck, but could not make out any details in the darkness. Robert decided to test whether the other driver was actually copying his movements or if it was just a coincidence. He signaled and moved into the left lane to pass a slower vehicle. The truck behind him signaled at exactly the same moment and moved into the left lane as well. Robert moved back into the right lane, and the other truck followed suit, perfectly synchronized like a choreographed dance. Robert was starting to feel seriously unsettled. He took the next exit, planning to stop for fuel and get a better look at the mysterious truck. But as Robert slowed down and moved toward the exit ramp, the other truck did not follow. Instead, it continued north on Interstate 35, maintaining the same speed Robert had been traveling. Robert pulled into a truck stop and climbed down from his cab, expecting to see the other truck pass by on the highway. But there was no truck. The highway was empty except for a few cars and one other semi heading south in the opposite direction. Robert walked into the truck stop and asked the cashier if she had seen another blue Peterbilt pass by in the last few minutes. The woman shook her head. "You are the only blue Peterbilt I have seen tonight," she said. "Pretty truck though. Looks brand new." Robert bought a cup of coffee and sat in the dining area trying to make sense of what he had experienced. Maybe he had been more tired than he realized. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. After 30 minutes, Robert returned to his truck and got back on Interstate 35. Within minutes of merging back onto the highway, the mysterious truck appeared in his mirrors again. This time, Robert was determined to get a better look at the driver. He adjusted his mirrors and turned on his cab/S interior lights, hoping to get the other driver to do the same. What Robert saw made him question his own sanity. The driver of the other truck was Robert himself. Same face, same hair, same shirt, even the same baseball cap. The doppelganger was mimicking Robert/S every movement. When Robert raised his hand to adjust his rearview mirror, the other Robert did the same thing at exactly the same moment. Robert slammed on his brakes, causing his truck to decelerate rapidly. The truck behind him should have crashed into his trailer or at least swerved to avoid a collision. But instead, the mirror truck simply vanished as if it had never been there. Robert pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat there for several minutes trying to calm down. His hands were shaking and his heart was pounding. Robert had always prided himself on his mental stability, but what he had just experienced challenged everything he believed about reality. Robert tried to convince himself that he had been hallucinating due to fatigue or stress. But deep down he knew what he had seen was real. There had been another truck identical to his own, driven by someone who looked exactly like him. And that someone had been copying his every movement with perfect precision. Robert got back on the road and drove the rest of the way to Kansas City without any other incidents. He delivered his load on schedule and began the drive back to Dallas. But as he entered Oklahoma on the return trip, the mirror truck appeared again. This time Robert was ready for it. He had purchased a dash cam at the truck stop in Kansas City and had it recording everything behind his truck. If the mirror truck appeared again, he would have video evidence that he was not losing his mind. The mirror truck followed Robert for over 100 miles, maintaining its perfect distance and mimicking his every move. Robert tried different tactics to lose it or force it to react. He made sudden lane changes. He varied his speed dramatically. He even pulled off at rest stops. But the mirror truck matched his every action with supernatural precision. When Robert reviewed the dashcam footage later, he discovered something that chilled him to the bone. The video showed Robert/S truck driving down Interstate 35, but there was no other truck behind him. The road was empty, yet Robert had seen the mirror truck clearly in his mirrors throughout the entire trip. Robert began to research similar experiences online and discovered that he was not the first truck driver to encounter a mirror truck. There were dozens of reports from drivers who claimed to have been followed by identical trucks driven by doppelgangers of themselves. The encounters always happened on lonely stretches of highway, usually at night, and always left the drivers questioning their own sanity. Some researchers suggested that mirror trucks were a form of paranormal phenomenon related to parallel dimensions or alternate realities. Others believed they were hallucinations caused by highway hypnosis or sleep deprivation. But the drivers who experienced these encounters were convinced that what they saw was real. Robert encountered his mirror truck 3 more times over the next 6 months, always on Interstate 35 in Oklahoma and always during night runs. Each encounter lasted longer than the previous one and left Robert more disturbed than before. The doppelganger in the other truck seemed to be studying him, learning his habits and mannerisms. During the final encounter, Robert decided to try communicating with his doppelganger. He held up a piece of paper with a message written on it asking, "Who are you and what do you want?" The doppelganger responded by holding up an identical piece of paper with the same message. Robert held up a second piece of paper with his name and phone number written on it. The doppelganger held up an identical paper with the same information. It was as if Robert was looking at his own reflection in a moving mirror. That was the last time Robert encountered the mirror truck. He never saw it again despite driving the same route dozens of times. But the experience changed him forever. Robert became obsessed with parallel dimensions and alternate realities. He spent hours reading about quantum physics and multidimensional theory, trying to understand what he had experienced. Robert eventually retired from trucking, unable to shake the feeling that somewhere in an alternate dimension another version of himself was still driving Interstate 35 looking for the original Robert Hayes. The thought that there might be infinite versions of himself driving infinite versions of the same highway was too much for his mind to handle. But sometimes late at night, Robert dreams that he is still behind the wheel of his truck, driving through the Oklahoma darkness. And in those dreams, he can see himself in the rearview mirror, following at a perfect distance and mimicking his every move for eternity. The question that haunts Robert is this: was he the original driver being followed by a copy, or was he the copy following the original? And if there are infinite parallel dimensions, then how many versions of Robert Hayes are still out there driving the highways of America, searching for answers they will never find? What would you do if you encountered a storm that defied all laws of nature? A tornado that followed you personally, hunting you down like a predator stalking its prey? This became the terrifying reality for truck driver Amanda Cooper when she found herself pursued by something that meteorologists insist cannot exist. Amanda had been driving trucks for 8 years, specializing in time-sensitive deliveries across the Great Plains. She was known for her ability to navigate severe weather and had driven through dozens of thunderstorms, tornadoes, and blizzards during her career. Amanda understood weather patterns better than most professional meteorologists and could read the sky like a book written in clouds and wind. That expertise made her encounter on Interstate 70 in Kansas all the more terrifying, because what she experienced that night violated every principle of atmospheric science she had ever learned. It was May 2021, during the peak of tornado season in Kansas. Amanda was hauling a load of medical supplies from Denver to St. Louis and was running ahead of schedule despite severe weather warnings across the region. The National Weather Service had issued tornado watches for most of Kansas, but Amanda had checked the radar and believed she could outrun the worst of the storms. Amanda was about 30 miles east of Hayes when she noticed the wall cloud forming in her rearview mirrors. It was a massive rotating cloud formation that stretched from the ground to over 40,000 feet in the sky. The cloud was perfectly round and spinning with a hypnotic rhythm that seemed almost alive. Amanda had seen hundreds of wall clouds during her years of driving through Tornado Alley, but this one was different. Instead of moving in the typical northeast direction following the jet stream, the cloud was moving due east along Interstate 70. It was following the exact path Amanda was taking. Amanda grabbed her weather radio to check for updated tornado warnings. The National Weather Service was reporting severe thunderstorms in the area, but no tornado warnings had been issued. According to the official radar, the storm system was moving northeast away from Interstate 70. But Amanda could see with her own eyes that the wall cloud was following her eastbound path. She increased her speed, hoping to outrun the storm before it could spawn a tornado. But as Amanda accelerated, the cloud formation seemed to accelerate as well, maintaining a constant distance of about 2 miles behind her truck. Amanda tried changing lanes and even taking different exits, but the wall cloud adjusted its path to follow her movements. It was as if the storm was locked onto her truck like a heat-seeking missile. Amanda had never seen anything like it in 8 years of driving through severe weather. The wall cloud began to develop a visible funnel that reached down toward the highway like a giant finger pointing directly at Amanda __'s truck. The funnel was perfectly formed and rotating rapidly, but it never quite touched the ground. It hovered about 50 feet above the pavement, moving in perfect synchronization with Amanda __'s truck. Amanda grabbed her CB radio and tried to warn other drivers about the unusual tornado behavior. Breaker, breaker, this is Storm Runner eastbound on 70 at mile marker 215. I have eyes on a funnel cloud that appears to be following my truck. All eastbound traffic be advised. The response from other truckers was immediate and alarming. Storm Runner, this is Wheat Hauler about 10 miles behind you. I do not see any storm activity in your area. Skies are clear back here. That was impossible. Amanda could see the massive wall cloud in her mirrors, and the funnel was clearly visible reaching down toward the highway. She tried her weather radio again, but it was reporting clear skies along Interstate 70. Amanda pulled over at the next rest stop, hoping to let the storm pass. But as she parked her truck, the wall cloud stopped moving as well. It hovered directly above the rest area like a malevolent presence, waiting for Amanda to continue her journey. Amanda walked into the rest stop building, where several other travelers were taking shelter from what they assumed was an approaching thunderstorm. But when Amanda asked them about the tornado, they looked at her with confusion. "What tornado?" a family from Colorado asked. "It is just a little cloudy outside. No severe weather at all." Amanda walked outside and looked up at the sky. The wall cloud was still there, spinning ominously overhead. But apparently she was the only person who could see it. To everyone else, the sky appeared to be partly cloudy with no signs of severe weather. Amanda got back in her truck and continued east on Interstate 70. The wall cloud immediately resumed its pursuit, maintaining its position about 2 miles behind her. The funnel cloud extended and retracted rhythmically like the storm was breathing. For the next 200 miles, the phantom tornado followed Amanda across Kansas. It stayed exactly the same distance behind her regardless of her speed or route changes. When Amanda stopped for fuel, the storm stopped. When Amanda got back on the highway, the storm resumed its pursuit. Amanda tried calling the National Weather Service to report the unusual tornado behavior, but the meteorologist she spoke with insisted that no severe weather was occurring along Interstate 70. According to all official weather monitoring equipment, the skies were clear. But Amanda knew what she was seeing was real. The wall cloud was massive and clearly visible. The funnel was well-defined and rotating rapidly. And the storm was definitely following her truck with an intelligence that no natural weather phenomenon should possess. As Amanda approached the Kansas-Missouri border, she noticed that the wall cloud was beginning to dissipate. The funnel retracted into the cloud base and the rotation slowed. By the time Amanda crossed into Missouri, the sky behind her was completely clear. Amanda completed her delivery in St. Louis and tried to put the strange encounter behind her. But 3 weeks later, while hauling another load across Kansas, the phantom tornado appeared again. This time it followed her for over 300 miles from Colby to Topeka before finally dissipating as she approached the Kansas City area. Amanda began documenting her encounters with the phantom tornado. She took photographs and videos, but the images never showed anything unusual. The sky appeared normal in all of her recordings, even though Amanda could clearly see the massive storm with her naked eyes. Amanda researched similar encounters online and discovered that she was not the first person to be pursued by a phantom tornado. There were reports dating back to the 1950s of storms that seemed to target specific individuals, following them across multiple states before mysteriously disappearing. Some researchers suggested that phantom tornadoes were a form of atmospheric anomaly caused by unusual electromagnetic conditions. Others believed they were supernatural entities that fed on human fear and anxiety. But no scientific explanation could account for a storm that was visible to only one person while remaining undetectable to weather monitoring equipment. Amanda encountered her phantom tornado dozens of times over the next 2 years. The pattern was always the same. The wall cloud would form in her mirrors while she was driving through Kansas. It would follow her for hundreds of miles, maintaining a perfect distance behind her truck. And it would dissipate as she left the state. Amanda eventually changed her routes to avoid driving through Kansas, but the phantom tornado found her anyway. It appeared during a run through Nebraska, then during a trip across Oklahoma. The storm seemed to be expanding its territory, following Amanda wherever she went in the Great Plains. The final encounter happened in April 2023, while Amanda was driving through Iowa. The phantom tornado had been following her for over 400 miles when something unprecedented occurred. The funnel cloud finally touched down. Amanda watched in her mirrors as the tornado made contact with the highway about a mile behind her truck. But instead of causing destruction, the tornado seemed to absorb something from the road surface. It lifted back up into the cloud base and began moving faster, gaining on Amanda //'s truck for the first time. Amanda floored the accelerator, trying to stay ahead of the approaching tornado. But the storm was moving too fast. Within minutes, it had caught up to her truck and surrounded her vehicle with swirling winds and debris. But instead of destroying Amanda //'s truck, the tornado seemed to scan it like some kind of supernatural radar. Amanda could feel an invisible force probing her mind, searching through her memories and emotions. The sensation was terrifying and invasive, like having her soul examined by an alien intelligence. After several minutes, the tornado lifted away from Amanda //'s truck and began to dissipate. As it faded, Amanda heard a voice in her head that was not her own. "We have learned what we needed to know," the voice said. "Thank you for your cooperation. You will not be followed anymore." True to its word, the phantom tornado never appeared again. Amanda has driven through Kansas dozens of times since that final encounter, but the skies have remained clear. Whatever intelligence had been controlling the storm had apparently gotten what it wanted. Amanda never learned the true nature of her phantom tornado or why it had chosen to follow her specifically. But she suspects that some atmospheric phenomena are not natural weather events, but something far more mysterious and intelligent. And sometimes when Amanda sees a wall cloud forming on the horizon, she wonders if other drivers are being followed by their own phantom storms. Invisible predators that hunt from the sky using wind and rain as their weapons while remaining undetectable to everyone except their chosen prey. Imagine breaking down in the middle of the desert at 3 in the morning with no cell phone signal and no hope of rescue. Then suddenly a mechanic appears out of nowhere offering to fix your truck for free. Sounds like a miracle, right? But sometimes miracles come with a price that is higher than you ever imagined. This is exactly what happened to truck driver Danny Rodriguez on a moonless night in the New Mexico desert that would change his understanding of life-death and the price of accepting help from strangers. Danny had been driving trucks for 12 years, hauling loads across the southwestern United States. He was known for his mechanical skills and rarely needed professional repairs on his truck. Danny maintained his equipment meticulously and carried a full toolkit for emergency repairs. But what happened to him on Route 66 near Tucumcari was beyond anything his mechanical knowledge could handle. Danny was hauling a load of furniture from Los Angeles to Dallas, taking the scenic route along historic Route 66 through New Mexico. It was September 2019 and Danny was running behind schedule due to traffic delays in Albuquerque. He was pushing hard to make up time when his truck began experiencing engine problems about 50 miles east of Santa Rosa. At first, it was just a slight loss of power going up hills. Then the engine began making strange knocking sounds that Danny had never heard before. By the time Danny reached the outskirts of Tucumcari, his truck was barely running and smoke was pouring from under the hood. Danny pulled over at an abandoned gas station that had been closed for decades. The building was a relic from the golden age of Route 66, with broken windows and faded paint advertising brands of gasoline that no longer existed. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete and tumbleweeds had piled up against the old fuel pumps. Danny climbed down from his cab and opened the hood of his truck. What he saw made his heart sink. The engine block had cracked and coolant was leaking everywhere. This was not something that could be fixed with roadside repairs. Danny would need a tow truck and major engine work that could take days to complete. Danny tried his cell phone but had no signal. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and there was no traffic on this stretch of old Route 66. Danny was stranded in the middle of the desert with a load worth $50,000 and no way to call for help. That is when he heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Danny looked up from his engine and saw headlights coming from the west. A pickup truck was approaching at a steady speed, kicking up a cloud of dust from the unpaved shoulder of the old highway. Danny waved his arms, hoping to flag down the approaching vehicle. The pickup truck pulled into the abandoned gas station and parked near Danny's disabled semi. The truck was an old Ford from the 1970s, painted primer gray with rust spots and dents that spoke of decades of hard use. But the engine ran smoothly and the tires looked new. The driver who climbed out of the pickup was a man in his 60s wearing faded coveralls and a baseball cap. He had grease under his fingernails and calluses on his hands that marked him as someone who worked with tools for a living. A patch on his coveralls read Miguel Auto Repair. Having some trouble, their partner Miguel said with a friendly smile. "Let me take a look." Miguel walked over to Danny's truck and examined the damaged engine with the practiced eye of an experienced mechanic. He poked and prodded various components, making thoughtful sounds as he diagnosed the problem. "Cracked engine block," Miguel said finally. "That is a serious problem. Going to need a complete rebuild or replacement." Danny's heart sank. A rebuilt engine would cost $20,000 and take at least a week to install. His delivery deadline was in 2 days, and his company would not be happy about the delay. "I can fix it for you," Miguel said casually. "Have all the parts you need right here in my truck." Danny looked at Miguel's pickup truck skeptically. It was barely big enough to carry a spare tire, much less the parts needed for a complete engine rebuild. But Miguel walked to the back of his truck and lowered the tailgate, revealing an impossibly large collection of automotive parts and tools. The truck bed seemed to extend far deeper than it should have been able to given the vehicle's exterior dimensions. Danny could see engine blocks, transmissions, and every conceivable automotive component organized neatly in the expanded space. It was like looking into a magical toolbox that contained everything a mechanic could ever need. "How much is this going to cost?" Danny asked suspiciously. Miguel waved his hand dismissively. "No charge, friend. I help people who are stranded on the road. It is what I do." Danny knew that professional engine work cost thousands of dollars. No mechanic would perform major repairs for free, especially not in the middle of the desert at 3 in the morning. But Danny was desperate, and Miguel seemed genuine in his offer to help. Miguel began working on Danny's truck with supernatural efficiency. He removed the damaged engine block using tools that seemed to work faster than they should have. Within an hour, Miguel had installed a completely rebuilt engine that looked brand new despite coming from his collection of used parts. Danny watched in amazement as Miguel worked. The man's hands moved with inhuman speed and precision. He never consulted a manual or asked for assistance. Every bolt turned perfectly. Every component fit exactly as it should. It was like watching a master craftsman who had been repairing trucks for centuries. "Try her now," Miguel said, wiping his hands on a rag. Danny climbed into his cab and turned the key. The engine started immediately and ran smoother than it had in years. All of the warning lights on his dashboard had gone out and the engine temperature was perfect. Danny revved the engine and listened to it purr like a contented cat. Danny climbed down from his truck and tried to thank Miguel for the incredible repair job. But Miguel was already packing his tools back into his pickup truck. "No thanks necessary," Miguel said. "Just remember to help someone else when you get the chance." Miguel climbed into his pickup and drove away, heading west on Route 66. His taillights disappeared into the darkness, leaving Danny alone with his perfectly repaired truck. Danny completed his delivery in Dallas ahead of schedule. The engine performed flawlessly for the entire trip, running better than it ever had before. But Danny could not stop thinking about his encounter with the mysterious mechanic who had appeared out of nowhere to save him. When Danny returned home to Los Angeles, he tried to research Miguel Auto Repair, but could find no listing for any shop by that name in New Mexico. He drove back to the abandoned gas station where Miguel had repaired his truck, but found no evidence that anyone had been there. No tire tracks, no dropped tools, no oil stains from the engine work. Danny asked other truckers if they had ever encountered a mechanic named Miguel on Route 66, but no one had heard of him. It was as if Miguel had materialized out of thin air, performed an impossible repair, and vanished back into the desert. 3 months later, Danny learned the true price of Miguel's help. Danny was hauling a load through Arizona when he encountered a stranded motorist on Interstate 40. A family with young children was broken down in the desert heat with no water and no way to call for help. Danny remembered Miguel's words about helping someone else when he got the chance. Danny stopped and gave the family water and food. He used his CB radio to call for roadside assistance and waited with them until help arrived. The family was grateful for Danny's kindness and tried to pay him for his trouble, but Danny refused their money. As Danny got back on the road, he heard Miguel's voice on his CB radio, even though no one else was speaking. "Thank you for keeping your promise," Miguel said. "Now we are even." Danny grabbed his microphone and tried to respond, but heard only static. He never heard Miguel's voice again. Danny realized that Miguel's free repair had not been free after all. The price had been Danny's agreement to help others in need. Miguel had been testing Danny's character to see if he would honor the unspoken contract they had made that night in the desert. Danny has encountered several stranded motorists since then and has helped every one of them. He considers it his obligation to pay forward the kindness that Miguel showed him. And sometimes when Danny is driving through the desert at night, he thinks he sees Miguel's pickup truck in his mirrors, making sure Danny is keeping his promise. Because some debts can never be fully repaid. They can only be passed along to the next person who needs help. And in the vast network of highways that connect America, there are guardian angels working around the clock to make sure no one is ever truly alone when their journey takes an unexpected turn. Every trucker has heard stories about the final mile, that last stretch of highway before retirement where veteran drivers encounter something that makes them question everything they thought they knew about the road. For Jack Sullivan, a driver with 35 years of experience, the final mile became a journey into the supernatural that would end his career in the most unexpected way possible. Jack had been driving trucks since 1985. He had seen the industry change from CB radios and paper logbooks to GPS navigation and electronic logging devices. Jack had driven every major highway in America multiple times and knew the location of every truck stop, way station, and good diner between Maine and California. But as Jack approached his 65th birthday and mandatory retirement, he began experiencing things on the road that his decades of experience could not explain. It started with small incidents. Phantom hitchhikers who vanished when he stopped to help them. CB radio transmissions from drivers who had died years earlier. Exit signs for towns that did not exist. Jack assumed these encounters were the result of fatigue and stress from too many years behind the wheel. He was looking forward to retirement and planned to spend his final months driving easy loads with minimal pressure. But the supernatural incidents were becoming more frequent and more intense. Jack's final assignment was a simple cross-country haul from New York to Los Angeles. A load of electronics that needed to be delivered by a specific date, but with no rush or special handling requirements. It should have been a relaxing farewell tour across the highways Jack had traveled for over 3 decades. But from the moment Jack left New York, strange things began happening. In Pennsylvania, he encountered a diner that served food from the 1950s and was staffed by people who seemed frozen in time. In Ohio, he was followed by a truck that disappeared whenever he tried to get a closer look at it. In Illinois, he heard children crying in his sleeper compartment even though he was traveling alone. By the time Jack reached California, he was questioning his own sanity. The supernatural encounters were happening daily now and becoming more vivid and disturbing. Jack considered abandoning the load and retiring immediately, but his professional pride would not let him end his career on an incomplete delivery. Jack was on Interstate 40 approaching Barstow when he encountered the most terrifying supernatural experience of his career. It was 3 in the morning and the desert highway was empty except for Jack's truck cutting through the darkness. The radio was playing classic country music and Jack was thinking about his retirement plans when he noticed something impossible in his headlights. There was another truck stopped in the middle of the highway directly ahead of him. Jack slammed on his brakes and came to a stop just inches from the other vehicle's rear bumper. The truck was identical to Jack's, rig down to the smallest detail. Same make and model of tractor. Same trailer configuration. Even the same company logos and license plates. Jack climbed down from his cab to investigate. The other truck's engine was running, but there was no driver visible in the cab. Jack walked around the vehicle looking for any sign of the person who had been driving it. That is when he noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The truck's logbook was lying open on the passenger seat. Jack could see his own handwriting documenting the trip from New York to California. Every entry was identical to the logbook in Jack's own truck, including entries for stops he had not made yet and events that had not happened. Jack returned to his truck and tried to drive around the mysterious vehicle, but it moved to block his path. When Jack backed up, the other truck backed up as well. It was as if the phantom truck was determined to prevent Jack from continuing his journey. Jack grabbed his CB radio and tried to contact other drivers for help, but heard only his own voice echoing back at him. Every transmission he made was being repeated by someone who sounded exactly like him but was saying things Jack had not said. That is when Jack realized the truth about what was happening to him. The supernatural encounters he had been experiencing throughout his career were not random events. They were signs that he was approaching the end of his time on the road. Every ghost, hitchhiker, phantom diner, and mysterious truck had been leading him to this moment. His final mile. The truck blocking Jack's path was not a phantom or a supernatural entity. It was Jack himself. Specifically, it was the version of Jack who had completed his final delivery and officially retired from trucking. The truck represented the end of Jack's identity as a professional driver and his transition into the next phase of his life. Jack understood that he had a choice to make. He could fight against the phantom truck and try to continue his career past its natural end. Or he could accept that his time as a truck driver was over and embrace his retirement with dignity and grace. Jack climbed out of his truck one last time and walked over to the phantom vehicle. As he approached, the other truck began to fade, becoming transparent like morning mist. Jack could see through it to the empty highway beyond. Jack reached out and touched the phantom truck's door handle. The moment his fingers made contact, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. All of the supernatural encounters he had experienced suddenly made sense. They had been preparing him for this moment when he would voluntarily end his trucking career and move on to the next chapter of his life. The phantom truck dissolved, completely leaving only empty highway ahead. Jack returned to his own truck and completed the final miles of his journey to Los Angeles. He delivered his load on schedule and turned in his keys to the company dispatcher. Jack's retirement party was attended by dozens of drivers who had worked with him over the years. They shared stories about Jack's professionalism, his mechanical skills, and his willingness to help other drivers in need. But none of them mentioned the supernatural encounters that had marked Jack's final months on the road. Jack never told anyone about the phantom truck that had blocked his path on Interstate 40. He suspected that every veteran driver experienced their own version of the final mile when it was time to retire. A supernatural test that determined whether they were ready to leave the road with honor or would become one of the ghostly figures that haunted highways, warning younger drivers about the dangers ahead. Jack settled into retirement peacefully. He bought a small house near the coast and spent his days working in his garden and reading books about the history of American trucking. But sometimes on quiet evenings, Jack would sit on his porch and listen to the distant sound of trucks on the interstate. And sometimes Jack would hear his CB radio crackling to life even though he had given it away years earlier. Phantom transmissions from drivers who were approaching their own final mile, seeking guidance from someone who had successfully completed the journey from active trucker to honored veteran. Jack would smile and whisper advice into the darkness, knowing that somewhere out there another driver was facing the same choice he had faced on that desert highway. The choice between clinging to the past and embracing the future. Between fighting against the inevitable and accepting it with grace. Because every journey has an ending. Every road eventually leads somewhere else. And the mark of a true professional is knowing when it is time to park the truck for the last time and walk away with your head held high. Jack's story spread through the trucking community in whispers and late-night conversations at truck stops across America. Veteran drivers would nod knowingly when younger truckers asked about retirement and the strange things that happened in those final months on the road. They understood that the highway had its own way of letting drivers know when their time was up. Some truckers tried to avoid their final mile by switching companies or changing routes. But the supernatural encounters always found them eventually. The phantom trucks, the ghostly passengers, and the mysterious radio transmissions were not tied to specific highways or geographic locations. They were connected to the drivers themselves, marking the end of one life chapter and the beginning of another. The trucking industry has always been filled with legends and ghost stories passed down from one generation of drivers to the next. Stories about haunted rest stops, phantom hitchhikers, and trucks that drive themselves down empty highways. But the final mile is different from other trucking legends because every driver who stays on the road long enough will eventually experience it for themselves. Young truckers often dismiss these stories as the fantasies of old drivers who have been on the road too long. They believe that modern technology and scientific understanding have eliminated the mysteries that once made highway travel so unpredictable. But veteran drivers know better. They understand that some aspects of life on the road cannot be explained by GPS systems or weather apps. The highway is more than just asphalt and concrete. It is a living entity that connects millions of people across thousands of miles. And like any living thing, it has its own consciousness, its own memory, and its own way of communicating with those who travel upon it. The supernatural encounters that truckers experience are not hallucinations or symptoms of fatigue. They are messages from the road itself. Jack's encounter with his phantom truck was the highway's way of honoring his 35 years of service while gently guiding him toward retirement. The road had been his partner and companion for decades, and it knew when their partnership needed to end. The final mile was not a punishment or a curse. It was a graduation ceremony conducted on the most appropriate stage possible. The open highway where Jack had spent the best years of his life. Other drivers who have experienced their final mile describe similar encounters. A truck that blocks their path until they accept that their driving days are over. A voice on the CB radio that calls them by name and tells them it is time to come home. A passenger who appears in their cab and guides them through their final delivery before vanishing forever. The details vary, but the message is always the same. Your time on the road is complete. You have served with honor and dedication. Now it is time to rest and let younger drivers carry on the tradition. Some drivers fight against their final mile, refusing to accept that their careers are ending. They ignore the supernatural warnings and continue driving past their natural retirement date. These drivers often meet tragic ends. Fatal accidents that could have been avoided. Health problems that develop suddenly. Mechanical failures that happen at the worst possible times. The highway is patient, but it will not be ignored forever. Drivers who refuse to heed the warnings of their final mile often become part of the supernatural encounters that future truckers experience. Their spirits remain bound to the road, unable to find peace until they accept what they refused to acknowledge in life. But drivers like Jack, who embrace their final mile with grace and dignity, are honored by the highway community. Their names are remembered at truck stops, and their stories are told around CB radios for generations. They become part of the oral tradition that keeps the spirit of trucking alive even as the industry continues to evolve and change. The supernatural encounters described in these 10 stories are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger pattern of communication between the highway and those who travel upon it. Every truck driver who spends enough time on the road will eventually experience something that challenges their understanding of reality. Some encounters are warnings about dangers ahead. Others are messages from drivers who died on the highway and remain connected to the road they loved. Still others are glimpses into parallel dimensions where different versions of familiar highways exist side by side with our own reality. The highway remembers everything. Every accident, every act of kindness, every moment of beauty and terror that has occurred along its length. And sometimes that memory bleeds through into the present, creating encounters that seem impossible but are undeniably real to those who experience them. The 10 American truck drivers whose stories you have heard tonight represent millions of professional drivers who have dedicated their lives to keeping America moving. They drive through every kind of weather and road condition to deliver the goods that our society depends upon. They sacrifice time with their families and risk their lives on dangerous highways so that the rest of us can have food in our grocery stores and products in our retail outlets. But truckers are more than just professional drivers. They are the guardians of America's highways. They watch out for each other and for the traveling public. They report accidents and hazards. They help stranded motorists and provide assistance during emergencies. They maintain an informal network of communication that spans the entire continent, sharing information about road conditions, weather, and safety concerns. And sometimes they encounter things on the highway that remind them that they are part of something larger than themselves. Something that connects the past and the present, the living and the dead, the real and the supernatural. The American highway system is not just a transportation network. It is a spiritual entity that has its own consciousness and its own agenda. The drivers whose stories you have heard tonight were chosen by the highway to be messengers. Their supernatural encounters were not random events but carefully orchestrated experiences designed to teach important lessons about life, death, and the bonds that connect all travelers on the great American road. These stories remind us that the highway is never truly empty, even when no other vehicles are visible. The spirits of those who came before continue to travel the roads they knew in life. They watch over current drivers and occasionally reveal themselves to provide warnings, guidance, or simply companionship during long, lonely nights. The next time you see a truck driver on the highway, remember that they are part of an ancient tradition of travelers who have always been willing to venture into the unknown in search of opportunity and adventure. They carry with them the stories and experiences of all who came before them. And someday their own stories will be passed down to future generations of drivers who will face their own supernatural encounters on the endless highways of America. But for now, their journey continues. Mile after mile, state after state, through darkness and light, through calm weather and storms, through the mundane and the miraculous. Always moving forward but never forgetting where they came from or the spirits that travel alongside them on the great American road. If these spine-chilling stories of supernatural encounters on American highways have left you wanting more terrifying tales from the road, then you are in for a treat. In our next video, we dive deep into 15 real horror stories from oil rig workers who encountered things in the darkness that defy explanation. From phantom crews working abandoned drilling platforms to mysterious voices calling from empty wellheads, these stories will make you question everything you thought you knew about what lurks in the industrial shadows of America. Click on the end screen now to continue your journey into the unknown and discover why some jobs are more dangerous than others, not because of the work itself, but because of what watches from the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. These oil field horror stories will leave you checking over your shoulder long after the video ends. Do not miss this terrifying continuation of supernatural encounters in America's most isolated workplaces.